want to welcome you to the Trauma Informed Educators Network podcast. This podcast is coming out of the Trauma Informed Educators Network Facebook group. I am so looking forward to talking to people globally about their trauma-informed journey. As the principal of Fall Hamilton Elementary School, a trauma-informed school in Nashville, Tennessee, I have learned that this is not a destination, and it truly is a process of learning and adjusting. So this podcast will be speaking to guests all over the world about people who are just starting their journeys and people have been on this journey for many, many years. So I hope you enjoy our guests. I hope you learned something just as I am. And welcome to the Trauma Informed Educators Network podcast. All right. I cannot believe that worked this time. So that's the first time I've ever played the intro on the same platform that I'm streaming. I tried it last week with Meg Baldwin and it was an utter failure. So I'm super excited that it worked. And apparently I need to update the intro because I'm not a principal anymore. And so I need to update that intro, but nonetheless,
you can always be a principal to a lot of kids.
Well, that I'm not a standing principal, I should say. Good point. So this is episode number 71. Unbelievable that this is the 71st episode of the podcast. This has been happening for a long time. I checked this morning. We're almost hitting 140,000 streams. And I found out that we were top 10 in New Zealand, which is super awesome. But nonetheless, I am so excited to have this conversation tonight for a variety of reasons. But tonight's my guest is Mustafa Muhammad, who I refer to as Schake. And he goes by Shake. He's a single father, business owner of EMBO, Empower, Motivate, Better Opportunities. He owns and runs a Mrs. Grissoms. If you're from Tennessee and Nashville, you know Mrs. Grissom, Panini Grill truck. He's an entrepreneur, a coach, a motivational speaker, and a convicted felon. He gets real about his experiences as a parent and how the system continues to be a barrier to getting his family what he needed or what he needs. Today, many people judge others by their past and do not notice where they are and what they've accomplished. So Shake, welcome. I must put a little note in here that I consider Shake a great friend of mine. We talk about every other month or so, maybe every month, depending. He was a father at Fall Hamilton and has since become a friend of mine over the last, it's been a long time, Shake.
Man.
7-8 years. I was a principal for 7 years. And then
all my kids had you at one point. So got 11th grade, 10th grade, 9th grade, and 7th grade, and all my kids had you. So yeah.
Wow. And just last week I was driving home and I remember I talked to Shake the week before and he's like, hey, I'm going to be at this elementary school with the food truck. And I'm not joking you. I'm glad there was not any police around because I about went on two wheels when I was going back to school and I saw the food truck and I pulled into the driveway, opened up the truck, and there was your youngest daughter who I hadn't seen in a long time. Got to give her a big hug and got to see you in action. And man, it's just such an awesome honor to have you on the podcast. We were going to do this before and life happened and it got in the way. But welcome to the podcast. And Shake, tell us the Shake story.
Appreciate you having me, brother. I guess you can say I'm Southern Tennessee now, but I'm originally from Michigan. Been down here over 20 years and, started family down here, had my ups and downs, convicted felon, go through divorce, kids, you name it, turning my life around. And same convicted felon that, Ms. Grissoms ended up sponsoring and put me into a position to be my own business owner and opening up the food truck with me cooking and giving a chance for my kids to, be able to pass something down to them and create that economical wealth, changing, generational curses. Along with that comes life and, ended up going through a divorce, single father. And you got to keep going through all of that. It's, life is going to happen, but I just keep finding a way to keep pushing through everything and trying to be the best father that I can be. But also, the one thing I've learned out here, and I know quite a few fathers and quite a few single fathers, there's not many resources for single fathers out here. So you know, latchkey child, in and out of juvenile as a kid coming up. And hell, my parents raised me right. You know what I mean? Shout out to my mom and Abu. You know what I mean? I was raised Muslim, both raised me right. You know what I mean? But, you know, I had other outside influences that pulled me to the streets and had me wanting to do what I chose to do. Spent the time in quite a few juvenile facilities and got out, did good for a little bit. But, you know, there's an old saying about, I mean, you got to be brutally honest with yourself, and that's when the change starts to happen. And it wasn't until I stopped pointing the finger at everybody else, pretty much. You know what I mean? My mom, my dad, the judge, the police. I mean, police didn't tell me to ride with a gun, open intox, and, you know, dope on me. They just doing their job. Judge didn't want to sentence me to that time. He was just doing his job. And for a long time, I didn't look at it that way. It was just, you know, part of the system. And though the system is rigged, it is trapped, does need to be abolished and rebuilt back up. I mean, there are things that we can do to prevent ourselves from the situations that we in. So,
you know, Shake, I think about your oldest, and man, it was the first couple years of it. Matter of fact, it may have been the first. It may have been the second. I can't remember, but you sitting in my office with your son and having the most candid, straightforward, down to earth, realistic conversation between you and your son that I just got to be a part of. And I told you at that point, I wish that other fathers could have heard what you said to your son. And now here, how many years later, we get to let other people hear the conversations, because the love and passion and caringness that you had for your child when he really didn't do anything terrible, but he still made a mistake.
The funny is, I remember that situation of him using when I told him, you can't start nothing, but you definitely can defend yourself. And I remember when he said he bumped the kid just so that he could start the what's the name of that. Yeah, my dad said I could do. Yeah, I did, but I said you also can't just start nothing. And just talking about the path that I went down, and so many of his uncles and all of us lived. Like, I mean, it's not what you want, because we know what it is. And I mean, I ran into a cat yesterday at Sam's Club. I ain't gonna say his name, but we all come from that era and that background. And the funny is, watching all of these guys that are doing something positive in the community that you're never gonna hear nothing about. You know what I mean? But, you know what I mean, beyond the backpack drop, like, they're helping feed families. They're doing this. They're doing a lot of underground work. You know what I mean? Shout out to Quanti Cash, you know what I mean, in Nashville. Mike True, yeah, I mean, with Gideon's Army. You know what I mean? You got a lot of brothers out here that's doing work in the community, you know what I mean, that don't get the credit. And we're not really looking for no credit. Like, you know, I mentored, and I'm not going to say the group that I mentored with, but even not working with the mentoring group no more, I'm still mentoring, dealing with a lot of those kids, you know what I mean, that I've dealt with that were placed with me with the group, or just from kids' friends, because they don't have father figures or have somebody there for them.
Well, you know, Shake, I think that you said a lot already, and I want to kind of tease out some of the things that you said, because I think a lot of times this work that we are involved in, this podcast is the Trauma Informed Educators Network podcast, right? I'm an unapologetic disruptor. When you say the systems are stacked, you're exactly right. They're working how they should, and unfortunately, they were not developed for everyone. It was developed, the systems and structures that we have in education and all aspects were really only designed for a few. But you said something that I think is really important. A lot of times in this work, we want to do things to people. We want to do it to people that don't live in the neighborhood, want to do things to people, or have never experienced a live experience, want to do things to people so they can do like I did or we do. And that's where we miss the mark in this work, where you mentioned some amazing people around Nashville who are doing the work in the community they grew up in or they live in, and they're a part of. And I think that's so important, that communities can heal themselves, right? It doesn't take somebody else coming in with a bunch of knowledge, although knowledge is really important. It's why we do this podcast. But the communities, if given opportunity and support, can heal themselves. What are your thoughts on that?
I mean, part of it is, I mean, the communities, I mean, it take back to Black Wall Street. There's so many of my white friends that had no idea about the communities and the thriving of how the Black economy and everything was, and realizing that, you know, when you shake the foundation and you take away leaders, or you take the thriving communities, and then, you know, you implement things of you taking the father out of the household, and you'll give assistance as long as the father, like, some of these things are by shape and by design. And until we disrupt that and change that, we, as not only man, fathers, community members, and everything else, we know what's going on in our community. But when you don't have the resources, you're under resourced, you know what I mean? You're being sourced out of your communities for you to be able to do anything, you know what I mean? There's, you begin to get, how do I say, you kind of give up and get defeated unless you're mentally, it's like I always tell people about jail, you know, there's no rehabilitation in jail. You have to want to personally rehabilitate yourself. You have to want to be the person to make that change. So in the community, there's a lot of people that want to make the change, want to do certain things, but we just don't have the resources. And when you see resources going to things that are outside of the community, or even there was a News Channel 4, one of them that did the thing about how North Nashville was split. And North Nashville, you know, the highest, you know, incarceration rate, you know what I mean, in the nation, but how a highway was split through. Like, people don't see how that has a long-lasting effect in history, you know what I mean, coming down to the present day, of how it affects the kids in all of these families that came from them. Jefferson was a thriving street, and I'm not from here. I'm from Michigan, but knowing the background of the families that I dealt with down here, that historically from St. Vincent and doing things, you realize the disruption and the effect that it has. Now, yes, some of them stood on their feet and they were able to pull themselves out, but you can't expect everybody to pull themselves out by the bootstraps like that.
And that's not how it works, right? Like, everybody responds to adversity in completely different ways. And just because one person stood tall and pulled themselves up, and the idea of people having to pull themselves up, like, has a burning fire in my chest, because people shouldn't have to be resilient to pull themselves up when there's things happening on purpose that are disrupting that. You also said something else when you were first talking, and I know we've had a conversation around this, and I want to have this conversation on the podcast. When you talk about, you know, not just showing up with backpacks. Backpacks are great, right? Like, people used to donate backpacks to the school, and we absolutely would give them to the students, but fill that "but" in, because I know you have a lot of thoughts around it.
Backpacks matter, I guess you can say, but not matter as much as people being there and the resources being there. You know what I mean? To a kid that's hungry, that backpack doesn't mean shit to him. You know what I mean? Well, they may be happy to have a backpack, but I don't know where my next meal's coming from. Or I may be at home. I can't go to school today because I have to watch my brother and sister because my mom's working 2 shifts, you know what I mean, and doing whatever she has to do to provide for the family. And mom wants to be involved to do more, but, you know, rent and all the other things are so high. And when you have dealing with inflation, it's like, how can you expect them to, when certain things that should be human rights aren't human rights? We put a price tag on it. And once we put a price tag on life, that became a problem for everybody. Like, you can't, no kid should have to decide whether they can get an education. You know, my friend posted something a long time ago, and it always stuck with me. What if the cure for cancer was trapped inside a kid who couldn't get an education? It's as simple as that.
It's true. And I think, and you and I have talked about this, the way we evaluate students, the way that we determine whether they are quote unquote gifted or smart, in itself doesn't even make sense, right?
No.
And the way we test kids to see if they're going to be college and career ready isn't fit for every kid. I know you were a good test taker. I was not, right? So by all accounts, not to mention all the things that I did in my life up until my late 20s, all accounts, I should not have been a principal. I should not have been an educated individual because I don't do well in those situations, right?
But yeah, I mean, I look at the standardized testing, and even with hell, come 10 ready, the kids are more stressed, and it isn't something that's going to their grades or anything else or any like. Back in the day, we had home economics. We had certain things in school that taught about life. And literally now, you got a lot of, there's no life lessons being taught in school where kids are learning about cooking, learning how to balance the checkbook, learning how to just deal with life in general. So how do we reach these kids? And because standardized testing, it stresses them out. And as a parent, shit, hell, I'll be stressed out about it before them. I was ready. My kids out. You have to, if it's not having an effect on your grade, but because it's about funding and what if you do get high scores, you get this funding. If you don't get it, you're not getting that funding. Like, what are we telling them?
And at the end of the day, we know that stress is contagious, right? It's contagious. We know that when the adults around kids are stressed out, kids are stressed out. There's a ton of research, and I've mentioned this book, and he was on here, Bruce Perry, on What Happened to You. He goes through the whole what happens to our bodies. We are herd animals, right? It's like if we're in a situation, if we're in public and all of a sudden a few people run, guess what? We're all running. It's just like if a deer is scared in a field, the whole herd will run, right? Well, it's the same with stress.
Take it to changing the way that we learn math, going from the way we learned math growing up to Common Core. You had teachers frustrated with students that were stressed out and everything else. And not saying that it's a bad way, but there some things that aren't broke, you don't need to fix it.
And at the end of the day, I think people who listen to this podcast we know we're not getting it right? And we know we have to do it differently, but there's these barriers of change that continue to get in our way. And at the end of the day, Shake, I always, this is what I hear often from educators. I would love to know a parent's perspective because I hear it, right? Well, it's not my job to teach them life skills. It's my job to teach them math, science, social studies, and reading, right? What do you say to that?
Best educator ever had. I count two on my hand that vaguely had, really had an important role in my life. Joe Doolin, the principal of Roberto Clemente out of Ypsilanti, Michigan, and Ray Pipkin, taught African American studies at Clegg Middle School. But that were unapologetically not just about books, but were about life, because it's just like coaches and the barber or anybody else. You're teaching life lessons, and that's what a lot of these kids need. Like I said, some of them aren't going to know about Thomas Jefferson and, or do they care about Thomas Jefferson? Because it's like reading an article earlier, and that's no shade, but it's shade that they said a love story between him and Sally Henning. No, that's not. When we look at the oppression of that was a slave and how these things run, when the reality is that kid needs to learn how to cook, or that kid needs to learn how to do this on their own. So some things that we're teaching, just are they really going to use them in life? And we have to gear our education towards these kids versus how we want to teach them.
So true. And we have an awesome listener, and this is Cindy from Aces Matter. She said she's curious to know, what is your go-to response to people that feel demotivated to follow the path of healing? For example, humans who pick the culture over generational trauma healing. And we know that intergenerational transmission of trauma impacts people, right? Generationally. We also know that historical trauma impacts people. So what is your go-to response to people that feel demotivated to follow the path of healing?
Let's see. My biggest thing is T.D. Jakes said it, and I listen to a lot of motivational speakers. Shout out Jim Rohn, E.T. Is learning how to keep going, and it becomes resources. I found out with my own self is I started telling my story, and the more people that I talk to, is the way I got more motivated to do more and realizing that, damn, there's a lot of people that feel just like me. And it's hard to, you know what I mean, find that motivation because it does feel, you know, you can get defeated at times. And I'm not going to sit here and say, no, there's a many a time, shit, hell, raising teenage kids, you know what I mean, you get defeated, but you mess around and you're on the food truck and you're talking and you say, if these kids don't kill me first, and you hear a story from another parent and then you end up having a conversation, you realize, shit, I'm not in this alone. And that's one way for me that I keep my motivation is by being so open with people and being able to talk to realize that I'm not alone in this, because until we actually right our wrongs as a country, then you're never going to be able to begin the healing to begin with. Like,
and what I heard you say, Shake, was relationships, right?
Yeah.
Relationships. Yeah. It's the conversations you and I have had over the last 8 years, where I remember those real conversations. I didn't talk to you as a principal. I talked to you as a parent. I talked to you as someone who has made terrible mistakes in their life, and by all accounts, and due to my privilege, only reason I'm able to do what I do, right? We've made very similar mistakes in our lives, and it's interesting how those mistakes brought us together, but we're both on this path of trying to make sure that kids, and even our own kids, you know, I talk about my child just like you talk about your children, that when they make mistakes, we have to try to help them figure out how to navigate the solutions to the problem, right? Whether it's at school, whether it's in life. But we also talk deeply about how can we disrupt the systems that we know are set against a lot of kids. And you, I don't know if for those that are listening, Shake is a black man, I am a white guy, right? We have these conversations in a real way of like, Shake, I know your challenges are going to be different than mine, right? But we navigate those together.
Well, see, part of it has to be, you know, I mean, people have to stop being afraid to have the conversation. You know, we're worried about what is going to offend, and I tell people all the time, you can't educate or teach somebody about your history, your culture, what you're going through, if you're not willing to have that conversation with them. You know what I mean? You don't have a conversation to try to change people's mind. You have a conversation to give the information. Once you give the information, it's on them what they do with it. But as long as you're giving the information, you'd be surprised at how many people through dialogue, you know what? I never looked at it that way. I can see how you feel that way. Like, I'm legit as hell now, but I still get paranoid at times when police get discounted at my food truck. I'm good with police all around the city, but it's still from trauma from my childhood and just generation in life, period, of as a black man that makes you like, that could be me. You know what I mean? And you see it where it doesn't seem like it should affect you, but when you see it on TV, when you know this, when you can see these kids feel that same way in their communities.
Well, and I think Cindy says start the conversation, stay for the transformation, right? And it's funny because Shake, you know, we're in Tennessee together.
Mm-hmm.
There are laws being passed where these conversations can't happen in schools, right? We can't talk about race. We can't talk. And at the end of the day,
I laugh at that because it was the funniest thing that it was created as critical race theory. It's not a theory if it's a fact. And so even the wordplay of how we use things sometimes is just to create disruption about it. Is like, well, it's not really a theory, it's a fact. You know what I mean, 400 years of slavery is a fact. The bombing of Philadelphia in 85 is a fact. And I would have white friends ask me, well, how did they get away with that? And, you know, and then you have to go through the whole Black Wall Street. You have to go through the history of it's been going on. And until white people start having those conversations that are uneasy with white people, will those things change?
Well, and I think you said it best, right? And what the push is to ensure we're not teaching real history that makes children feel bad, right?
Right.
And I think at the end of the day, you're right. We know that healing has to happen through not you teaching me, not other Black African American people teaching white people. It's white people having conversations, because these conversations are not new in the Black community, right?
No.
These conversations have been happening for generation after generation. It's the stigma that's been put on the white community not to have these conversations.
But
And at
see,
the end of the day,
you should never feel bad about having to teach that. And you know, that thought of the kids feeling bad about learning history, it's not them. The bad comes is when we perpetuate it and allow it to keep going without teaching them, so that we don't have a way to stop it. And until, you know, I mean, it's like the TikTok generation that went against their parents and this, that, and the other, where it's like, oh, damn, I found out my parents may be borderline racist. They teach us to be inclusive, and then, whoa, my parents are doing this. And it blew up on TikTok. But that's the reality of it, is it's going to take this next generation of kids, and especially white America, being able to have that conversation with white America, instead of it being, because Black folks, we have it, you know, it's the head nod, dinner table. We have that with my sons, with my daughters. You know, you have to be 10 times better. You can't move like this. You can't do that. It's just a reality and a fact for us. And for a lot of the kids in the projects, or just living in underprivileged areas, you know, that's always on their mind, in the back of their mind. I mean, when you deal with a 6-year-old that worried about the police shooting me, I mean, and I would deal with it coming from Hamilton at times, I mean, where I've talked with a lot of kids, and it's like, why does this kid even have to worry about this at this age? But that's what they see. That's what they know. And see, our counterparts don't have to have that conversation, but need to have that conversation of, that's empathy of why do they have to feel that way? And how can I get an understanding so that I can teach mine not to be this way, so that we can start changing and shifting the way the talk goes.
Well, and Shake, even down to my role as a principal, right? I had to change a lot of perspective about my role as a principal, because I had awful experiences in school. A lot of the parents at Fall Hamilton had terrible experiences in school. And even the teachers weaponized me, right? Don't make me send you to Mr. Portel. Don't weaponize me. Like, I'm not the grand hammer of the punishment, right? Let's have a conversation around, let's figure out what's going on. And that's what we did so well at Fall Hamilton. We wanted to, that didn't mean kids didn't get consequences, right? Kids got consequences, but it made sense. We quit putting kids out of school. And I know there's a lot of controversy around that. We knew that wasn't a practice that worked, right? We wanted to work with kids, and not because their parents didn't care, not because their parents were bad parents. Like you said, a lot of our parents, and I'll never forget, I suspended one little boy, and I got a call within the first 3 hours of the next day of school saying, "Hey, are you the principal?" "Yes." "Do you know you got a student up here at the corner store on Rains?" And I went, "Do you know his name?" They told me his name. It was the kid that I suspended. And I thought, this is not working. It's not working. We've got to do something different. But at the end of
we're holding parents accountable now for things that parents are doing their best at. And, you know, I said it to an officer the other day, and I said, well, you've got it to where parents are afraid to parent, teachers are afraid to teach, and police are afraid to police due to these stigmas, and everybody worried about what's going. Somebody had, like I said, they say you can't raise kids the way that we were raised because it's a new time. I feel you still can. You've got to teach them about more things because it's more modernized, but having that conversation, like I said, my parents raised me right. The things that I chose to do wrong, but the difference was Judge Francis held me accountable as a juvenile. He ain't trying to lock my parents up. Like, my mom knew damn well I went to the school. She knew I caught the bus, dropped me off, did this. I left the school. That wasn't her fault, but when you're putting that on parents, and parents are worried about this child that's doing good or this child that's doing that, and I'm working 2 jobs, that becomes a stress, and it discombobulates the whole family at that point.
But Shake, something that you and I have talked about is there are parents that are asking for help. There are parents that are needing help, saying, listen, I know this is not a good situation. I know my child is struggling. I need help, that are told, sorry. Right? I mean, that
goes back to our resources and where we're allocating them to. And are we doing a lot of this funding with a lot of these different groups just to show face and say, you know, we've got a great mission statement, but we're really not about our mission statement of actually helping the child. It's like I said, these kids know when it's election year or you come through the community and it's just a quick photo op. Like, they're not dumb. They know that you really don't care about them. And, you know, a lot of the programs, even for Nashville, these kids know, look, I'm going to get probation 6 months. They'll be in and out of my life. I might do this program. I might do that. And they're done with me. And then we're dropping them back right off into the same environment that they're in with no tools. Something's got to give about that.
Absolutely. And Cindy says stress requires a nervous system conversation or else, right? And I think, you know, you and I have talked about this on a lot of different levels, but the science behind stress and what it's like in your body, right? Like, your body's response to stress absolutely plays a major role in how you interact with the world, right? And if we have kids that are doing the best they can in homes that are doing the best they can, sometimes that still puts us in a state of stress, right? Parents are stressed out, teachers are stressed out, kids are stressed out. We have to have conversations around how can we systematically support the paradigm shift of not punishing kids, because that doesn't fix the problem, right? It doesn't teach. It doesn't just, it's not about accountability only. It's about accountability to support kids and communities to heal, right? To be able to navigate the world. Nobody's ever had skills punished into them. It doesn't happen. And for sure, trauma has never been punished out of anyone.
Yeah, well, it's accountability with redirection. You know what I mean? And you have to find somewhere to go with it that way. And a lot of it starts with conversation, you know what I mean? Just with the kid. Like, a lot of times we as adults, like I said, the stress that we have adults that can't deal with stress. So we find ourselves asking a kid to do in school what a lot of adults can't do. And that becomes a problem. Like, these kids are still learning how to process this, how to deal with that. And just say, okay, 5-10 day suspension. Well, pretty much now they're on the video game because parents got to work, got to do this, that, and the other. And you're basically creating a latchkey child at this point by keep putting them out, when we've got to pull that child in. Is, well, how can we do something different? And we can't keep passing the buck. We'll say, it's not my job, it's not this, that, because ultimately that latchkey child or that kid that's out there ends up affecting somebody from somebody's family at some point, depending on what road they take in life. And for most, you know, people that make the laws, or that it's never nothing until it actually affects yours. Like, you know, it's like the heroin epidemic. It's in, unfortunately, white people's backyard now, where it's like, oh shit, we gotta do. But during that crack era in the 80s and everything that came up, it was just like, let's lock them up, let's do this, let's do that. You know, mandatory sentencing, predicate. Yeah, I mean, it's the same situation right now.
Don't we have even the words we use, right? Mm-hmm. We call it the opioid epidemic. Then we called it the war on drugs. Even the vocabulary that's used, right? Because we know that the opioid crisis, and especially in rural America, it's having a massive impact, right? But when we think about, let's go back in history and think about why the terms we use. There was a reason it was called the war on drugs, right?
Oh, yeah, because, I mean, but that becomes, like I said, we as America have to get honest about our history. And that's one thing that, you know, you don't want to, a lot of people don't want their faith shaken, or don't want what they're used to. They don't want that ground rock to say it could be another way. Like, so a lot of people don't want that problem right there, where I've been doing it this way and that's the way I'm running with it. Well, that might not be right. You know what I mean? Where you, like I said, and that's nothing against the churches, but you know what I mean, when you have different laws for, you know, child abuse sex inside the churches versus what happens inside, outside in just regular America, that becomes a problem. You know, you're going to send somebody for 25 years with the diocese, we just be done with it. But that trauma lives with these people forever.
There's so many pieces that we have just completely pulled back. And welcome to Shake and I's conversations that we have about every month, because we talk about all of these things, right? Because we have to be able to peel back the onion. And Shake, you and I, I mean, the consulting that I do is called Paradigm Shift Education, because when we push against paradigms, right? When we push against somebody's core thinking, and if this isn't true, then this potentially isn't true either, right? And if that's not true, then what I've done could be all messed up. Well, I want to tell you that at the end of the day, that was my journey of learning. When I realized through ACEs, the Adverse Childhood Experiences Study, and the neuroscience and the physiological responses to stress and trauma, and when I started seeing kids' faces, a lot of the kids, and I could name them, which I would never do, but that we were physically restraining in school, and it was all their response was due to what situation they were dealing with at that time or in the past. And instead of standing in a space of support and understanding why their systems were dysregulated, we were like physically restraining them. And then on another level, Shake, as a white male who grew up in an all-white community, I didn't even know the racism that I had. I didn't even know the stereotypes that I possessed until I was one of the only one or two white kids at TSU at a historical Black college and university, where I was like, I still have bias that I have to. We all do, right? But
that's the thing, though. We have to be honest about that. We all have implicit bias, whether we believe it or not. You know what I mean? We all have it. I mean, I have implicit bias against pumpkin pie. I'm a sweet potato pie guy. I mean, that it's just the way that I grew up in the culture that I'm in.
Absolutely.
That's just what it is. Like with pumpkin pie, like, no, I got sweet potato pie. That's the way I came up. So we all have it when it, whether it's race, no matter what happens, but it's being able to have those conversations of why do you feel that way? Where did that start at? And how do we work on changing the narrative about it? Because a lot of people, like I said, they want to learn, just don't know how to start that conversation.
Well, and I also, Shake, I want to be honest and say we can't put the whole weight on each individual parent in each individual community, because at the end of the day, it's a systematic problem, right? The way we handle parents in schools, the way we handle kids in schools, the majority of the teaching population is predominantly white female, right? Even in our highest of minority communities, it's still that demographic. We have to start saying, what are we going to do different systematically to start addressing some of these in schools? In schools, I'm not even talking about there are amazing people doing amazing work, but in schools, we have to start having these conversations. We got to have them with our parents, because Shake, I knew from the moment that I heard your mouth open up, you would literally do anything for your children except make an excuse. Anything. You would go to the end of the earth, but they would always own what they did, and you would always validate, you did it, and we have to have a conversation on how we're going to fix this. You're not going to excuse your way out of it, right? And I think as I watched you as a parent, it made me a better parent, because your love is so deep, but yet you still have that life lesson of, listen, I get it. It's hard. This is hard, but we got to figure out how to do it differently, because you went through it and you don't want your kids to have to go through it.
No, and it's even with the kids that I mentor, kids that, come to work with the food truck with me, do different things. Like, it's constantly, a battle of having that dialogue and conversation. But it's the one thing I always think. My mom and dad told me I'm coming to get your ass one time. That's it. I used that up at a young age. In juvenile, the next time I was there, thought I was getting out at, you had to be out of juvenile by like 6 o'clock. Yeah, I know, Muhammad, you staying. Oh, man, what the? But that accountability of learning things on my own and having to do that, and that love for my parents, like I said, that somewhere along the line we lost tough love, where the blame is pointed at everybody else versus actually letting the child learn through things. And you can still be there and love your child and be there to help them through it, but you have to let them take that responsibility and give them the tools to guide through that. Like, even, when we talk about the stuff, dealing with my sons, like, love him to death. And I'm always be there for him, and I'm always help push him through it. But some things, as my father told me one time, at a certain point in time, all you can do is give good advice. And it's on them whether they choose to listen and take it. You always be there for them, but at sometimes you have to step back and let them learn and still be there to give that advice and help them get through it. But you're not going, because you'll drive yourself crazy.
Well, Shake, and I know your kids know this because they've come back and we've chatted, right? I've always said, I'm always going to be a principal, right? And I'm always going to be there. I can be there to celebrate or I can be there to support. It doesn't matter to me. I'm always going to be there. And I've stepped in that space for many, many kids over the years, right? I've stepped in that celebration of, wow, look at, and oh man, we've got to figure out what we're going to do. But you're right. But I think one thing that you do so well that needs to be validated is you also understand that we have to change the systems on a lot of levels in order for this paradigm to shift, right? You understand the complexities that have happened historically and in current times.
Yeah, well, even dealing with the juvenile courts down to certain things. Look, I get it. I always tell people I'd much rather deal with a kid that just stole the Snickers out the Dollar General than the kid that already has a Glock 19 in my face. It's just as simple as that. I'm not saying throw them with bad kids, but we have to give the resources for, DCS is on the news 2 or 3 times a month at this point.
Yep, I saw it yesterday, actually.
Understaffed, under-resourced, and without things. But we'd have to change how communities and people look at them. You say DCS, people look at thinking getting their kids taken away. We have to change that thought process of how we deal with things. The juvenile courts, there's judges and stuff that want to do things, but they're restricted by red tape and bureaucracy. And until we put the resources in the community, like I said, I'm all for every Titan fans that love the Titans and want to see a new stadium. But until one of these kids is carjacking your family members or running in your house, then are you going to start questioning, or one of these lawmakers start saying, well, okay, maybe we do need to change something and we need to give these kids the resources that they need. Because you believe it or not, a lot of these kids want to do better. You can see it in their face. They, when you get them out of their environment and you get to show them something different, you see that child, you see that hope and everything in them. But until we give them the resources to do that, nothing's going to change. And we as a community can do it only so much without the system being broken and the system changing as a whole.
And Shake, I told you, man, 45 minutes was going to go by in a furious time. I mean, it was just going to fly by. So couple things. Shake, if people want to get a hold of you, they want to contact you, they want to follow you on social media, where can they find you?
Social media, I'm still at Mustafa Muhammad, on Facebook, but, for the business and food truck wise, Miss Grissoms Panini Grill on Instagram or on Facebook, Street Food Finder. Email schake08@gmail.com. Phone number 615-673-5461. I'm an open book.
No calls after midnight, please.
I'm still because my phone is always open for everybody. And even people like, who's that calling? My phone's always open because you never know when, I've missed one of those calls and losing a family member. And, that's one of the feeling. But so my phone is always open. And like I said, I'm here for anybody that, whether it's dialogue or just needing somebody to talk to. Like I said, we all need that because the teachers, Joe Doolin and Mr. Pipkin and Mr. Ratcliffe that started the Saturday Academy, I rebelled and gave them hell then. But the funny is, everything that they showed me is things that I'm using still to this day that helped and probably saved my life, even with my mom and dad. Like, yeah, that ass whooping and them leaving me in juvenile and this, that. I cussed them up and down, couldn't stand it. I thank them for that. You know what I mean? Because it helped me grow to be the person that I am and where I'm at today.
Well, Shake, I didn't tell you I'm going to do this, but I'm going to mute you and I'm going to mute me, and I want all the listeners, including the podcast listeners and the live listeners, I want them to see you in your mode. I want you all to listen to this. This is a song that Shake wrote and created a video for just a few months ago. And so I'm going to play it really quick, and then we'll come back and wish everybody well. But I want you just to listen to the words. I want you to, if you're on here live, I want you to watch this. And I will share a link when I produce the podcast, because when I saw it, it hit me to the core as a father. So here we go. Watch this. Well, maybe in just a second. Hold on. Oh, I can't do it, you all. Oh, well, I'm going to play the audio. So listen to this. You can't hear it, can you?
I can't, but
oh, man.
Do appreciate that, though. I didn't even know you was going.
Well, I am going to figure this out some way or another. I just put it in the chat, you all, and I hated that pause because I could hear it, and it's so good. And if I could figure out how to get it over, I would, and I can't. But you all, I put it in the chat. Please listen to it. Give it a like. Give it a share. Shake is a very talented, amazing artist and entrepreneur and father and friend. And for all of those of you who listened and commented, thank you so much. If you want to follow me, Shake, I'm going to actually put it in the podcast, by the way, because it's just too good for people not to hear. But nonetheless, if you want to follow me, you can follow me on Principal List. That would be Instagram and Twitter. I usually put all my deep thoughts on Twitter, Instagram. You'll just like see me fishing. And if you want to follow me on Facebook, same thing. It's just like my family, my kid playing soccer. He just got a brand new little ponytail on top of his head. He thinks he's so cool. And I think he's pretty cool too. And then LinkedIn is a lot of professional things that I share. Please use the hashtag TIE Network when connecting to the podcast. And then as well as the Disruptors Unite. Unapologetically, we have to disrupt what has always been done, because what has always been done isn't working for all kids. And it's time that we have equity as a driving factor, that all kids can see their own genius and meet their own potential, and not potential that I see in them, but they see it within themselves. So thank you all very much. Shake, thank you for your time. I hate that did not play, but we will get it on the podcast. And for those of you online, thank you for being here live. I will be back next week Matter of fact, the next several weeks. I was 2 months off traveling and speaking and doing all of that. But I am now back. So thank you all again. And please go to the world and be awesome. All right. Thank you all for listening. Much appreciated. Shake, give me just a second. We'll connect offline here.
Got you, brother.
All righty.